Welcome to 10 Minute History, where the past happens fast. I'm your host, Taylor Smith. Joining me today is Suzanna Krivulskaya of the University of Notre Dame. Suzanna, thanks so much for sitting down with me today.
Thanks for having me, Taylor.
Of course. So, Suzanna, I know a little bit about it, but so our listeners know, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about my dissertation, which will hopefully soon become a book. It is titled Disgraced: How Sex Scandals Transformed American Protestantism, 1832 to 1988. And it's a study of the trajectory and consequences of Protestant sex scandals involving pastors, as covered in the American press.
So this is a large time frame that we're covering, but to make sure that you and me and our audience are all on the same page, are there any really big developments in sex in the United States that people need to understand to get the points that you're making?
Absolutely. There are many huge developments, but perhaps the most important one for understanding this project is that we're transitioning from a kind of Victorian sexuality, very restrained, family-oriented, reproduction-oriented, to a modern age in which sexuality is being debated, divorces become more accessible, laws become more liberal, homosexuality enters the picture. So there are huge, huge changes in this time period.
Okay, good to know. Now, speaking of this debate, I know from what we've talked a little bit that the press, the American press, serves a crucial role in this larger conversation about sexuality, as well as the particular topic of your research. So how is the press involved in these sex scandals and their kind of broader significance?
I started the 1830s during the big revolution in the press, when newspapers are becoming cheaper and more accessible to the reading public, and when the press figures out that the kinds of stories that sell are stories about sex and murder and things like that. And yet they're still very careful in the New Republic about the, as they call it, the preservation of public morals. They're concerned about what they're publishing. So they go from the 1830s to a kind of silence around Protestant misdeeds to an embrace of sensationalism by the 1870s. There's a brief period of cooperation in the early 20th century between churches and newspapers, but this all disappears after some big developments in the 1920s and in the mid-century. And by the end, we have the press assuming a kind of posture of moral superiority over religion, in particular conservative religion.
Interesting. Okay. So the press adopts a certain posture towards some of these religious scandals. How is the public reacting to this, and how does their reaction change over the course of what you've studied?
We start with a very invested public. I have letters to ministers like Henry Ward Beecher in the 1870s during his adultery trial, in which people are pleading with him to please not be guilty because that will affect their theology of salvation. To eventually, fast forward a century, there's a kind of desensitized public on both sides. The secular critics of religion are kind of tired of the repeated sex offenses among the clergy, and their defenders actually, or their followers, come to the defense of these preachers.
Now, you mentioned this defense of ministers by the public. What did that look like?
We may want to call it more of a forgiveness than a defense. There is a real push to articulate theologies of sin and the fall and subsequent grace as followers are struggling to interpret the misdeeds of their ministers.
Okay, so if that's how it's affecting the American public, how then, bringing this together, we've got the press, we've got the public, how does this affect American Protestantism?
They also undergo a profound transformation. If in the 1830s and even through the 1870s, they're much more willing to stand behind their ministers. They will supply them with lawyers and write letters in their defense. This shifts in the 20th century when churches become much more quick to disassociate from problematic pastors.
Interesting. So can you give us an example of what that shift might have looked like?
Looking at a couple of Chicago-based institutions, the Moody Bible Institute and the Moody Church, very important institutions started by the great evangelist Dwight Moody in the late 19th century. I got into their student files from the early 20th century, and I looked at some of their recommendation letters, which revealed to me how aware they were about the potential of scandal to compromise prospective pastors. So recommendation letter writers were given these forms, and for women, for example, they ask whether they were, quote, unselfish, teachable, willing in manner. And for the men, very revealingly, they ask whether they have bad habits, have backsliding or a history of backsliding, and, quote, is he discreet in his conduct toward women? So we're very concerned with what kinds of people are we going to train to become ministers. And then when they do have scandals in their midst, there are letters to the effect that, look, we have this guy, he's in trouble, let's make sure this does not leak out to the press. When inevitably it does leak out to the press in the 19-teens and the 1920s, the Moody Bible Institute and Moody Church are very quick to cut ties with those pastors.
So no more lawyers being provided.
No more lawyers.
No more extravagant defenses. This is...
Precisely.
We've done what we can, and now we're kind of cutting this off before it affects the rest of us. Oh, interesting.
And alongside that, too, they're now forming church publicity departments. And this is much broader than just Moody or Chicago. But in Chicago in the 1920s, they hold the first ever national conference on church publicity, and they reach out to the Associated Press to try to kind of get out of the gutter and to also focus, in addition to the scandals that churches are known for at this point, to also focus on some of the good work that they're doing.
You're kind of trying to divert the press's attention to some of the other activities that the church is up to, not just the scandal.
Exactly. The AP responds very positively, and then, of course, the following year, 1925, we have the Scopes trial that divides the nation, and 1926, we have the disappearance scandal of Amy Semple McPherson out of Hollywood.
Oh, sure, okay,
so it all kind of goes to hell from there.
Yeah, it would be hard for newspapers not to pay attention to those stories, I think.
Exactly.
That's reasonable. So certainly some really interesting developments here, but bringing this home for our listeners, why is this history of not just the scandal, but the coverage of and reaction to this scandal something that someone needs to know?
I think we're in this interesting age of reckoning with power abuses among not only religious folks, but also obviously in entertainment and comedy and TV. Movements like Me Too and Church Too are finally listening to women and to victims of power abuses. And there's a longer history there that I think needs to be considered. And my story is not necessarily one in which, bad guys get brought down for their misdeeds. But I do think the really instructive lesson that we can take from this long view of scandal history is that scandals do something beyond punishing the people involved or rewarding the people that confront folks in power. The real strength in scandal and the study of scandal is that they begin conversations in the press about sexual morality, about religion and sexuality more broadly, and I think that's the real contribution.
So what you've found then is that the fallout of this scandal starts conversations, has impacts that far, far, far exceed maybe the shelf life of the scandal itself.
Precisely. That's the hopeful takeaway of the project.
Yeah. Well, as you said, these scandals started important conversations, and I really appreciate you having this, what feels like a very important conversation with us today here at 10 Minute History. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thanks again to Suzanna for that interview. If you want to get in touch with Suzanna, you can do that through her personal website, which we're going to link to in the episode description. As always, thanks again for listening to 10 Minute History, and since I couldn't come up with a topically relevant closer for this episode that didn't sound gross, I'll just simply say that 10 in 10 Minute History, it's a soft 10.